due to the transition of the country from the decade of autocratic rules. And this has resulted in trust deficits in institutions and highlighted political contestations. Now, regarding economy, we all know that it is already undergoing an economic crisis and has approximately 30% of its people living in below poverty line, and large migrant population group is also there. And also, if you look at the health system of Myanmar, the periphery is very much underdeveloped with poor health infrastructure and extreme uh, precarity in especially the IDP camps. Uh, and health-wise, if you see, if you when usually the global public health community uh, use a surrogate indicator of HIV rates, which is highest in entire Asia in Myanmar. That means the highest number of immunocompromised people are in Myanmar. That means that if there is a huge outbreak of COVID-19, it would be more difficult to be clinically managed, and the outcomes will be, prognosis will be worse in Myanmar. Now, the first case in Myanmar, if you look at this, purple color stacks, I hope you like the color. So these purple color stacks, the first case was started on 23rd of March. And in fact, there were two cases which came up on the same day. And they had a travel history of UK and US, especially the first two cases came as an imported cases, followed which there were more indigenous cases that started coming up. And within 1 month, the country handled more than 300 cases with 6 fatalities. You see this 6 fatalities total from Myanmar, and approximately 50% of cases are still to date are imported and mainly concentrated in areas with good health coverage, which means it's I mean one contestation or one argument which Myanmar media and Myanmar public health experts have been saying is that more than 70% of entire Myanmar cases are only from Yangon state, right? But then there is a limiting side to it, and the challenge is that why maximum cases are only from Yangon state? Why not from the peripheral states? Because, like I said, I already mentioned, the health infrastructure, the surveillance systems, the sensitivity of the surveillance system has been poor in those peripheral areas. And you know that there is a limiting testing capabilities, which implies that there are a lot of unknown cases. Now, the Ministry of Health and Sports, so they have a combined ministry which is called Ministry of Health and Sports, already developed health sector contingency plan, and they're operating under the national level health central committee. And one of the good thing, one of the lesson that we can learn from Myanmar is that they also have, under the Ministry of Social Welfare, developed a relief and resettlement strategic plan, which means they, right from the beginning, already decided, thought through that when a COVID-19 person recovers, how can we ensure there is a smoother resettlement, which is a part of the resilience planning of COVID-19 response strategy. From here, I would just want to mention one example. When I was in Sierra Leone, and was handling Ebola outbreak, we often used to see that, people used to get devastated economically, socially, culturally. There was a lot of stigma, and only after approximately 1 year of settlement of the outbreak, when the dust completely settled, then the government of Sierra Leone decided on development of a resilience plan, which was too late, and that resulted in a lot of chaos, a lot of mistrust among the community for the government. Now, uh, in summary, the most important weakness in Myanmar is that they have been late responses, and there's a large migrant population which primarily comes from Thailand and Indonesia, and there are high percentage of imported cases. Now, you would agree that those imported cases are usually residing in Yangon state, are usually affluent, and usually from and have access to the public health system. They are usually educated, so they are the ones primarily contributing to the large number of cases. So Myanmar should be looking into what's happening around the periphery, especially in the IDP camps. And I don't want to mention you would already know what's happening in the Rakhine state, and there are non-displaced stateless people in the remote areas of Rakhine and other locations with limited access to the healthcare. Those aspects also they need to look into. Now let's go to the next country, which is Sri Lanka. So we'll click Sri Lanka. So if you look at Sri Lanka overall has so far reported more than 2,700 cases of COVID-19 and has faced 11 case fatalities. Now, comparative to the previous two countries, I can say that Sri Lanka has higher attack rate of 13.3. Now, the global average attack rate is approximately 4.2%. And so anything that is above 4.2% is considered higher attack rate. And Sri Lanka already has 13.3. Now, wait for the surprise when we will discuss Bangladesh and India. So now the first case in Sri Lanka, if you look at this green stack and comparative to the green stack, the purple stack have suddenly started looking, shrunken, and they're starting to look invisible almost. So that means there are so many number of cases only from Sri Lanka. Now you would see there is the first case in Sri Lanka was reported from the 3rd of March, and this case was basically from a tourist guide who was a Sri Lankan who provided support, especially the travel support to a group of Italians who actually had visited in Sri Lanka then. So you can say that the first case in COVID-19 in Sri Lanka was linked to Italy. So, and you see, there is somewhere I've mentioned 206. Now, this is unique. This is unique. And I think this is one of the important lessons that we can learn from Sri Lanka. And what exactly is this? Now, I would not... Sorry? Okay. So the number 206 is very unique. And this number is actually being mentioned by the government of Sri Lanka of late. Initially, they used to mention by the name of the person. I don't want to name the person because the government of Sri Lanka already decided to avoid the stigma for that person, we would be using the number 206. And what exactly happened is that this case number 206 has been linked by Sri Lankan authority to nearly country's 2,600 COVID-19 cases, which became a matter of sensationalization in the entire country and in the entire world. So which means of the 2,764 cases, almost 2,600 cases can be linked, epidemiologically linked, like we say the transmission trees. So the transmission trees goes back to this guy, which is number 206. And what exactly was the situation with 206? So this guy, this poor chap, was actually was a drug addict, and so he used to be living in one of the island areas near Colombo, and so he used to take a lot of drugs, and one day his money finished, and when his money finished, he started looting and doing robbery, and he was caught by the villagers and was handed over to the police. Now at the police station, this guy number 206 had fever as well as leg injury, which was sustained during the robbery. So the authorities admitted him to the nearby hospitals, where he tested positive for the coronavirus and stayed there for 31 days. And after he tested positive, the police who made the arrest actually started tracing who were the contacts for this guy 206 case. And then there were more than 100 people who were ordered to quarantine at home. But not everybody complied to those orders. And afraid that the virus would spread rapidly in the near congested area of Colombo, the Sri Lankan Navy were sent to ensure that those people are staying in house. Now, what happened was history, because then there was a melee between the local people, the villagers, and the Navy, and they fought with each other. Not literally fought with arms and something like that, but there was a melee, you can say. And due to the melee, there was cross infection from these local people to the Navy guys, and ultimately, the first infected sailor or the Navy sailor who was on leave in the town was, and somewhere maybe 300 400 kilometers away, tested positive, and immediately the next day 30 more Navy sailors came positive, and approximately 4,000 Navy sailors were quarantined inside a single camp, while more than 200 relatives were sent to Navy-run quarantine centers. Now, this is a unique story, and ultimately, finally, approximately 900 Navy sailors tested positive, just because of this case. So we can learn a lot from this story from Sri Lanka. Now, going to the next country is Maldives. So where do we have Maldives? We have Maldives. So So we have Maldives here. Let us click from here. This is Maldives, yeah. So when we look at the Maldives, it is interesting that it is also contributing to less than approximately 0.15% of the entire Southeast Asia cases. The first case appeared, if you look at these yellow stacks, the first case appeared little late than comparative to the other Southeast Asian countries, and that was on 15th of April in Maldives. And this was a reflection of the fact that many other neighboring countries had already stopped their travel, and so people did not visit Maldives as they were doing earlier. And but the interesting thing happened was that within 2 months from then, within 2 months, approximately 2,000 cases came positive. And this happened in one of the most densely populated capitals in the world. You would know that which ranks, under 2025 in the list of cities that are most populated and most densely populated ever. So at the outset of the outbreak, the country did not have capacity because it's a small country having confluence of islands, and they did not have capacity to even diagnose coronavirus. And samples used to be sent for diagnosis to outside country. And the turnaround time from the sample received to sample came, the results coming was usually a week sometimes. And this mechanism was not at all supportive to the early detection and isolation of cases. And this was one of the fundamental reasons that led to COVID-19 continuation in Maldives. So this is another lesson that we can learn in Southeast Asian country and from Maldives, that the lab diagnosis, and especially the prompt lab diagnosis, is very, very important. Now, you would see when you look at the history of Maldives, you would see that the most of the outbreak response has been focused in Malé, which is the capital, and all cases are reported in other parts of the country are linked to Malé cases. So, which means that when the outbreak started in Malé, people did not, comply to the government authority orders of not moving within the country. They started moving from one island to another, and that leads to the entire, most of the islands, habitated islands, are infected with COVID-19 as of today. Now, the number of COVID-19 cases gradually increased after the state initiated to steer the company toward a new normal. Now, this is a very interesting story, and I think one should also look at this story and remember as a lesson. And what is that? The government, what they did was that they actually said that we need to follow a new normal. So after the initial period of lockdown, they were the government said that okay, let's start easing out the lockdown restrictions across the country. Sorry. So the government used the word new normal. So let's live with the new normal. And people, because they were poor, many of them were illiterate. They did not understand what is new normal. They thought new normal means that they have to again start living as they were living before. So what they did not understand is new normal is, they need to be doing certain activities, certain preventions, precautions, respiratory hygienes, preventive precautions. So those things were not clearly established. So the lesson that we can learn from here, again, second lesson from Maldives, is that communication is very important. It needs to be clear. It needs to be strategic. It needs to be understood by the community whom we want to address. And due to which, ultimately, Maldives government realized their mistake, and the National Emergency Operations Center, which is the main body managing the COVID-19, actually, they changed the strategy of new normal to saying that new normals with restrictions, something of those sorts. So and we should also be cognizant of certain strengths that Maldives brings. And one of the key component of Maldives has been that there has been a strong Malay outbreak response plan to introduce lockdowns, screening all primary and secondary contacts, which really helped them in tracing all the contacts and then establishing quarantine around them. Usually it was mostly quarantine was home-based. So this has helped the Maldives COVID-19 transmission to finally stable, and currently it is looking that it would not spike again. Now, the government has also established a travel clinic, which is unique, and we can learn third lesson from Maldives is that we can have a travel clinic exclusively, especially to the returning, immigrants or returning people to address their specific queries, and that has helped them. So, and in total, there are in the entire country there are total 14 clusters across, which are very predominant and very famous. So let's go to the next country, that is Thailand. So we go to Thailand here. I know we usually don't go these countries nowadays literally, but I can take you to many countries online. So let's talk about Thailand. Now, Thailand has an attack rate of 4.8, which is uh, slightly higher than the global average. And they have, cumulative case of 3,282, and total fatality had been so far has been 58. This data, as I mentioned earlier, is from the last weekend, so there could have been increased now, but the death number has been stable, and has not been any percentage changes both in the cases as well as in the deaths for the last week, during the last week. Now the first case, if you look, this orange bars are all from Thailand. So the first case started very early, somewhere in the 13th of January, and coronavirus reached Thailand through a Chinese woman, actually, who was a resident of Wuhan, and who visited, you know, her native country. And surveillance among incoming travelers was already established, which revealed a small number of cases throughout the country. So, which is another important lesson, that Thailand surveillance system started very early. And so right from 13th of January until 13th of January, which means in 2 weeks, there was first local transmission was confirmed using the surveillance, which they already established. And during the month of February, the number of cases usually remained low. If you look at this February, so number of cases usually remained low, and with approximately 40 confirmed cases by the end of the month. So this was attributed to several transmission clusters, and the largest of which has been called as Murray Thai flight cluster. So it's called Murray Thai flight cluster, and which was one of the gap, which was one of the mistake that the government did. So what the story is that so they actually there is a culture that they allow fighting. There are fighting clubs in Thailand, and so one of the very famous fighting club is located in Murray. And so the government actually allowed that fighting club to operate on 6th of March, which was here, somewhere here, as the cases were coming down. So this is when they allowed opening of this club, and there more than 200 people visited this club. And so, and this was wrong. This was wrong about, wrong about organizing this club, because ultimately the confirmed cases rose to over 100 per day after this. So recognizing this, I mean, in the month of March, if you look at this, there were certain initiatives which government of Thailand took, and I think all of us should learn from this initiative. And the Prime Minister of Thailand, which is Honorable Prayut, actually declared a state of emergency, and all commercial international flights were suspended, and lockdown measures were implemented very strictly in most part of Thailand, and which were observed by most people. And so government was sharply criticized also on various aspects of initial response, very strict adherence to protocols, but they helped them, because if you see the number of, the epidemiological curve, it has sharply descended, and finally it is looking that they are looking good. And another good thing about Thailand is that the Thai government response to the outbreak was initially based on surveillance and contact tracing, which helped them, do the surveillance through temperature and symptom screening at the airports, investigations, and long-standing research were also done in coronavirus. And I think this is important. And so in Thailand, there is a lab which had long been doing research on bats and their viruses which are obtained from bats. So this lab initially very much promptly started doing testing for coronavirus, and this really helped Thailand, because Thailand was one of the countries where the COVID-19 testing started very early. And and nighttime curfew, you would know that in Thailand, most of you would know who have visited Thailand, is that there is a nightlife in Thailand. So Thailand, the nighttime curfew was in lockdown of much of everyday life was implemented by the government, which was respected by most people. So there were less of or least of movement in the night also, which helped in gradually, graduating the curve. Now, based on which, altogether, if you look at, Thailand is one of the star player in COVID-19 success history. In fact, the United Nations is planning to, the WHO and the United Nations is planning to actually have chosen two countries, which is Thailand and New Zealand, and they're trying to think of doing some film documentary in a couple of weeks. So we would be having a lesson from Thailand, which we should be learning from, and I think. And another aspect we can learn from Thailand is Thailand strategically opened medical tourism. So they, not for all the COVID-19 patients. So for COVID-19 positive patients, there will be restrictions, and everybody who wants to travel there for medical services would need to submit certificate of best health and COVID-19 negative results at least 2 weeks prior to the travel, and then they would be allowed. And this is one of the strategic country which is capitalizing kind of confronting the economic impact of COVID-19 on various industries through propagation of medical tourism, and which is a very, very important lesson that we can learn. Now, going to the next country is Nepal, and there are 4 countries left. I'll be very quick. I know I've taken a lot of time, but I'll be quicker now. I'll be faster now. So if you look at Nepal, which is here, small dot. So yeah, so this is, you see the curve is, even though there is a descent, but then it has not completed more than 80% descent. And so at the end and for last couple of days, there has been again a spike which is upcoming. So there are chances that the spike will go up. Now, Nepal is also very interesting, and there are so many lessons that one should learn. And among all the countries, like I mentioned in Myanmar, the government infrastructure, because they have changing, it is leading to a lot of systemic challenges. And similarly, there are challenges in Nepal, because Nepal has been lurching forward since 2015, and is transitioning from a unitary state to a federation of provinces. So you would know that first time elections were held in Nepal in 2017. So it is only a 3-year mature government which is existing in Nepal. Now, even though they are doing a lot of good work, but one thing that has not completely transformed, or we say transition, is that the highly centralized, the highly centralized government has not given empowerment to the provinces. And so in Nepal, there are three tier system. So gradually what has happened is not all the provinces, not all the states have, or the nodes of power, which are the nodes of power for planning and implementation of different programs, have got enough power, enough resources, enough infrastructure, enough health facilities to implement whatever the central body is saying. And there is a lot of dialogues, and there is another aspect, another challenge, that there are certain nodes of power in the sense of this, in the sense of these states, which are trying to even, not agree with the central government, because they want to do their things in their own way. So you see that if you look at this green bars, which are for Nepal. So in the early months of pandemic, media has pointed out, for example, that how clear communication of reliable health information has been compromised by a cacophony of statements. So everybody is saying, everyone who wants to prove their point. So the lower health system wants to prove their point that they are doing best. The middle tier wants to prove their point that they are doing best. The topmost government wants to prove their point that they are communicating the right thing. So there is entire cacophony in the health system, and the community is literally confused. Whom should they listen? So this is another lesson that we should learn, that the communication has to be clear, it has to be evidence-based, it has to be uniform across all the layers of health system, and which is not happening in Nepal. So if you look at, right now, there is a weak coordination system also existing in Nepal to support quarantine system, since many people have evaded the quarantine process entirely, and because of the inadequate facilities. So there were lack of food, lack lack of basic amenities as reported by media. So I'm not saying that I've gone there, but I've traced some of the media coverings and which mentioned that people evaded from these quarantine centers primarily because their facilities were not appropriate. And while the management of this facility is the role that sits with the local government, I mean, the local government have started complaining to the higher, the national government that this is their responsibility. There's a whole lot of chaos, whole lot of mixed approach, which has resulted in challenges around COVID-19 management, and which is seen in the high number of cases, more than 18,000 cases reported so far, and with 44 case fatalities. Now, there is an argument people are saying, a couple of people, especially one sect of public health community in Nepal, are saying that even though they have more than 80,000 cases, they only have 44 fatalities so far, because predominantly Nepalis are very, very strong in innate immunity. But that is not an argument that we can live with. I think the global public health community has surpassed those mediocre, public health, misunderstandings, and I think the misbeliefs are proliferating faster than the real evidence. And this is one of the cases that we see in Nepal. So let's go to the next country, which is Indonesia. So Indonesia is here. And this is one country which presents challenges quite similar to what we see in Bangladesh and India. And now I'm saying little bit similar. There are more similarities between India and Bangladesh, but the stories from Indonesia also gives us important lessons to learn. And one of the important lessons that we learn is that this is like India and Bangladesh, this is a very populous country. In fact, if you look at the total population, this is the fourth most populous country in the entire world. And its capital, Manila, is the second most populous city in the entire world. So, and there is where exactly is the similarity? So like in our cities or capitals, there's a whole lot of mix of culture, religion, and geographical factors, which are unique to that country of 17, and it has 17,000 islands. So it is not easy to ensure that the COVID-19 pandemic management goes well across all the islands in a very standardized way. And it's almost impossible for the government to contain the disease in all the areas. But the good thing is that you can say a good thing, even though it is technically not a good thing, that most cases are limited to 2 clusters. So we have, Jakarta cluster, which erupted in the month of March. So if you look at this graph, in the month of March, the cases started suddenly booming up. And what exactly happened is that, so in one of the hotels, there was a dance place where a lady was infected with COVID-19 and she was performing. And this cluster is popularly also known as Jakarta cluster or dance bar cluster. So a lot of people, hundreds of people came positive. So and one of the important challenge that Indonesia failed to recognize is that there was super confidence in that we will be able to ensure that we will be able to manage COVID-19 very effectively in Indonesia. But what exactly happened is contrary. So what we see happened actually in Indonesia is that only when the cases came in Jakarta, which is one of the south cities and one of the most populous cities in Indonesia, not much was learned by the public health then in their understanding about how to test how to test samples for coronavirus. In fact, they did not have enough reagents to test suspected cases, and only the entire country only had one laboratory that was in the capital Jakarta that was capable of conducting the PCR testing. And there was short of, and the most of the healthcare workers were short of protective gears in the form of PPE or gloves or face masks, and there were stories in Indonesia which were captured by media that doctors and health staff used to wear simple raincoats while working in the hospitals. So one of the wrong things, I'm saying wrong thing because wrong can also give us important lesson, and that is that inspired by China's success and being superfluous and doing the makeshift arrangements, the president of Indonesia, which is Mr. Jokowi, actually instructed his ministers to build a similar facility like China is doing for managing the COVID-19 cases. And this is a good gesture, but the implementation strategy was wrong because they chose one of the remote island, which was approximately 500 miles away from the capital, to be the very much spot of COVID-19 clinical cases management. Now, how would people move from there? For they would have to travel 500 miles to ships, to small boats, or to planes sometimes to be carried for management there, and which was a wrong strategy. So they made a point that they want to do a hospital setting up, but what they did not realize is that the hospital should be nearest. The access is important for the community, and this is a lesson that we should learn. Now, another important lesson we can learn, and especially India and Bangladesh, is that our countries, India and Bangladesh, also like Indonesia, has significant Muslim, population residing in our country. And for the nation like Indonesia, which is having highest, not highest, which is having highest Muslim population in its entire cohort of population, have to perform burial rites, especially which normally requires the family to ensure that the disease is cleaned soon after their death, and the dead body is buried in a cotton and linen cloth and not cremated or inferred in a coffin. So there are protocols that they have to follow. And but what in Indonesia, people did not follow that. So the instructions on burials were given to the community. The community ignored those burial protocols. So there have been important stories which have been captured by United States media also, and media across Indonesia also, that people literally opened the ambulances, forced open the ambulances to take the dead body of their relatives, and then they took them and they flew with those dead bodies in their personal cars. And this is not a one story. There have been many stories like this. And so government was not able to control and communicate with the government, with the community. And this is seen even till date. You see that throughout country, Indonesia is one of those countries. I'm not saying this is the only country, but this is one of those countries where many people don't wear face masks, even in the crowd. And on a visit to a east, and government has, I think the government has already warned them that they should be wearing this at least face mask. But if you look at that, 70% of its population don't wear masks, as reported by certain media houses in Indonesia, which is not good. And another funny thing is there are two more stories around Indonesia that we should learn. One of them is that you must have heard that the main airline in Indonesia is Garuda Airline, which is the Garuda Airline is the national flag carrier there. And just like we have Biman Bangladesh in Bangladesh, and we have Air India in India. So that's where we have Garuda Indonesia as the main flag carrier there, and the airline was considering substituting the PPE kit for their cabin crew by simple face shield, because the president of the Garuda Airline said that this is a hospitality industry, and people, when they want to embark on a plane, they want to see air hostess smiling and the air staff smiling. So with a PPE, they cannot see the air crew member smiling. That's when the face shield is enough. And this is one of the important wrong strategy. Another surprising story which erupted in Indonesia was their agriculture minister declared that he has discovered a necklace which can prevent COVID-19 infection among the community. And there were a lot of people who started following him. And imagine if the union minister, I'm not saying he was a health minister, he was a minister for agriculture, but still, he had a lot of followers. And so imagine what community would have done when they listened to such miscommunication. So this is important, I think, when we want to learn from stories from Indonesia. Now coming to the last two countries, which is Bangladesh and India. I think you guys, since the most of the audience is from Bangladesh, and I think Dr. Salim would be the right person to tell the details on COVID-19 from Bangladesh. But I'll still touch up about certain important uh, program development, I would say. And I would request Dr. Salim to fill in wherever either I'm going wrong or I'm incomplete. And I'll be happy to be corrected. Now, we see that in Bangladesh, when suddenly you place those stacks of COVID-19 in front of Indonesia, Bangladesh is so much apparent. I mean, it looks like this is the country where such a big epidemic is going on. And while the epidemic curve has started going, started descending, and which and the global public health community, especially WHO and UN, is also commenting that there seems to be promising times in coming weeks, especially for Bangladesh, because the progress is looking real from the perspective that this is sustained, over the period of weeks. Now, what exactly is the scene, what not, whether there will be more eruptions in future? I think this is such a difficult question, which I think most people cannot answer today. In my understanding, at least, I cannot answer, and I don't want to do the mistake of answering it. If you want the answers, you can either go to journalists. If you want the answer, you can go to politicians. They perhaps would know more stories than technocrats, including epidemiologists like us. So in my simple understanding and analysis, we have yet to see what the future has to unfold in front of us. Now, Bangladesh has the second highest attack rate in the entire Southeast Asia, which is more than 100, which is more than 100 right now, which is important. And I'm sure all of you know what is attack rate. Attack rate is the number of the people who get infection out of the at-risk population. So let's say if in a room there are 50 people and outside the room there are 20 people, and the infection is introduced inside the room, so the denominator at-risk people will be 50, not total 70, because the outside people are not at risk right now. So considering this, there is a high attack rate. Now, the question can be why there is such a high attack rate in Bangladesh. So one of the important reasons behind this is that the density of population in certain cities in Bangladesh is very, very high. I think it, especially like example in Dhaka, in district like, I've been in Bangladesh, so I know a little bit. Please, I would request Dr. Salim to fill in if I'm going wrong, or if you want to add more information. So districts like, so the most cases are coming in Dhaka, the most cases are coming from Chattogram district, most cases are coming from Rajshahi district. These are the districts where the most of the populations are living right now in Dhaka. And so, but the good thing is that the case fatality is not very high. So it's still around 1.3%. So the first case in Bangladesh came up, if you trace this green stacks, first case came somewhere on the 8th of March. And government of Bangladesh very proactively, engaged their senior technocrats, and the entire ministry was, bring forward under the leadership of respected Sheikh Hasina. And then the government of Bangladesh declared general leaves, which extended to up to 30th of May. And what I sense from some of the media covering is that, now I may be wrong because I'm covering it through media coverings, that people did not literally understood the meaning of the general leaves. So while it was purposed for lockdown essentially, but not everybody, especially those vulnerable population, those who are poor people, those who are illiterate people, not necessarily understood the clear technical meaning of lockdown and the compliance related to lockdown. And there could have been a risk due to this misunderstanding between the special or general leaves and the lockdown. So I think this could have been one of the reasons why in initial stages, even when government of Bangladesh took right decision on right time for lockdown, they perpetually was not understood by the community at large. So this is important lesson. Like I discussed from other countries, the communication is one of the important strategies that we need to be keeping in mind whenever devising public health interventions. Now, there are good things about Bangladesh. So one of the good things is that there are 28 dedicated hospitals in that, which are spread across the country. Naturally, mostly located in Dhaka, but they're spread over in 5 districts. That's what I understand. And there is a good system overall to track the bed occupancy and the treatment offered. And I think one of the very good things that I found was on the official website of DGHS is that there is a constant tracking of this data. So anybody, and it is an open data, so people can see, people can track what the hospitals are doing. And I think this is one of the important good things that we should continue. And I think people in India also should learn from this intervention. Another good thing is from Bangladesh is that, approximately 60%, in fact, more than 60% patients have recovered in Bangladesh. So people need to be told that, look, COVID-19 is not a disease which is not manageable. See, there is a misunderstanding. It may not be treatable, it may not be curable, but it is manageable because the God has given us innate immunity to fight the disease, due to which approximately 60% of coronavirus confirmed cases in Bangladesh have recovered, which means body must be doing something for recovery. And this important, so we must ride, so we must take the opportunity of riding on the better horse. And the better horse right now is that there is a lot of recoveries, and we should not continue to ride on dead horse. That is how many people have died. I know it's important, but we should also ride on better horse. So another good and third and important thing that I want to mention that I noted in my review of literature was that I think in Bangladesh the government has, especially under the direction of BGHS, have done hospital preparedness assessment, which involved setting up of control rooms, training medical teams, setting up of isolation units, and especially the OPDs for RTI patients, and which is very good, bridging the gaps, especially from the clinical aspects. So they have a good surveillance system. They are responding through the good management system. But last thing that I want to mention is Bangladesh. I think number of test cases have also been significantly high. I think they have done more than 11 lakh approximately, not 11 lakh. So yeah, same. If I 10 millions, 1.1 million tests have been done across the country so far in COVID-19, which is significant. But there are unique challenges in Bangladesh also. And when I'm saying unique, I will also distinguish unique and some similar challenges in which they share with India. So one of the common challenges that they share with India is that both have densely populated cities. And one of the unique challenges that Bangladesh has, they also have the world's largest refugee camps, which is having more than 1 million Rohingya population, and which is phenomenal task. And with COVID-19, there have been observations, there have been reports mentioning, there have been noting down that the humanitarian response has reduced, especially because the health facilities, the health system has been redirected to support COVID-19 outbreak, and due to which they are not necessarily so much engaged in humanitarian responses as they used to be. Now, one of the flip side to this is that if this continues for long, then there could be chances that if there is an outbreak in this camp setting, especially the IDPs, then to manage those IDPs, especially and manage the COVID-19 IDP camps, can be a significant challenge. And for a couple of reasons. Number one, the population density in these camps is very high, very, very high. Second is that the number of water available. For example, I've noted from one of the UN reports that on average, every family has around 11 liters of water given in those camps, which, I mean, there can be more, there can be less, but this is as per the report. But if it is so, then one of the operational challenges comes is when you advocate for hand hygiene, there could be non-adherence to strict hand hygiene by these IDP people, especially the refugees, and which can present as an important risk to the spread, contributing to the spread of COVID-19. And then I think that on the initial stages, we have heard through my personal discussion also that there were limited supplies of PPE, particularly during the early phase of pandemic in Bangladesh, but that has been resorted to much an extent, which is a good thing. And I think, and if somebody asks me what is the reason that is contributing to phenomenal number of cases every week in Bangladesh and in India, then I think the common reason that I identify is that both in Bangladesh and India, the community is not complying to the directions given by the government, which essentially is not only the responsibility of the government, which is should be the onus uh, on the part of community. Now, it is a very complex situation. It's simple to say, but it's very complex because at one hand, we want everybody, regardless whether they're affluent, educated, vulnerable, migrant, uneducated people, to be understanding the technical aspects of hand hygiene, respiratory ethics, and at the same time, we know that they have not understood the gravity of the situation. They have not understood if they don't comply strictly with these protocols, they will always essentially be at risk of either uh, getting the infection or spreading the infection. So, I mean, this is all about Bangladesh. So let's go to the last country in the row, which is India. Let me take a pause. Yeah. So interestingly, if you look at this graph now, you would see that all the stats, the yellows, the purples, uh, the greens, they have all almost squeezed to such an extent that visibly we are only be able to see three colors. One is the pink color, which stands for India, the green color, which is for Bangladesh, and blue color, which is for Indonesia. And if you look at India alone, they contribute to approximately 80% of the entire Southeast Asia cases. Bangladesh, for that matter, contributes approximately 13%. Right. So coming back to the India and summarizing very quickly, the attack rate is also very high in India, just like in Bangladesh. We also have an attack rate of more than 100. And that's, like I said, is predominantly because of there is a high density of population in certain areas. And you would see that in India, the most cases are coming from 3 states. So most of you would know that in India, there is the health system, the administrative system is basically 3 tiers. So we have national body, we have states, and we have districts. So the state is not existing in Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, there is a national body, there is a division, and then there are districts and upzilas. In India, there are national, then there is states, then there are divisions, and there are districts. And similar to upzilas, we have blocks. So yeah, so coming back to the COVID-19 situation in India, most cases, like I was mentioning, are predominantly coming from 3 states, which are Maharashtra. If you look at this western part, this is where the Maharashtra state is. And then there is a Tamil Nadu, which is here. And then we have Delhi, which is the capital, NCR. So these 3 states total account for more than 50% of the entire Indian cases reported in India. And the total cumulative cases in India have been 13,000, 36,000, sorry, 1 point, more than 1.3 million. I am usually in habit of speaking in lakhs, so I have to quickly manage. Sorry for that. And the total deaths that have come in India are significant. I think the case fatality wise India is having 2.3 case fatality right now, which is less than the global average of 6%. But still, if you this is an average of 2.3. But if you look at the last couple of weeks, the case fatality is little bit on the higher side. So there are challenges in terms of management of cases, especially because there are some of the cases are coming on have been captured in the later stages of the development of illness. Now, some of the salient points about India is that it was one of the earliest countries to declare a lockdown, and that certainly gave them some time and opportunity to slow the spread. So if you look at this purple bars here, in the early phases, they're not stepping up just like you see in the United States. So they're gradually, and this is when initially there was a confidence that Indian government has taken the step which will ultimately not lead to a pandemic in India, that which we are seeing as of today. But the issue is, the challenge is, as the lockdowns were eased. So there were 4 phases of lockdown: lockdown 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. But as the lockdown was eased, community started moving, and behaving normal. So, and even though they are adhering to wearing masks or at least a cloth around their face or maybe essentially most of them participating in hygiene of minimum hand hygiene, but that is not uniform, especially in the vulnerable population, especially in the migrant population, especially in the rural areas, especially in the urban slums, especially in areas where there are, heavily dense migrant populations are living, like in Dharavi, which is Asia's biggest slum in India, located in Mumbai, in Maharashtra. So so this is where the challenge is happening more, occurring more. And I think while in India the health infrastructure has been at large inadequate, I would say. Why I'm saying inadequate, even though this total number wise it will surpass many countries in Southeast Asia, but when you divide by the number of population, that's where you see that the health facility, the services to the 1,000 population or 1 million, 1 lakh population, 100,000 population has not been standard, has not been same across all the states, and the gravity of problem, deepens, especially in the urban settings, in the urban slum settings. So India has also faced challenges similar to Bangladesh in the initial phases, that there were low testing rates, which has given a serious setback. And now at least the states which are contributing to the highest number of cases, we are seeing that a significantly high number of tests are being done. Like for example, in Delhi, we're seeing that 14,000 tests are being done every day. And you would know that in Delhi also they have set convalescent plasma bank also, which is one of the aspects on management of severe cases, but is usually assumed by the community as if some out of the world things have come up and they need not worry. I think this is where essentially the government should continue to give clear messages that look, this is as part of clinical aspect strengthening of clinical pillar strengthening of COVID-19 management, but there are more to it. The public health aspect is the strongest pillar, which is the pillar that needs to be built more strongly. So overall, I would say that given the role of state governments, Indian health system, the response in India needs to be understood from the state level perspective also, because in India, the health is a state subject. So whatever the national can give guidelines, but it is the implementation authority is only the state, where currently more than 50% of cases are coming from 3 states. So what I'm trying to say is, even though the government has given right guidelines, right guidance, the state authorities need to do some targeted intervention so as to ensure that they come out of this, managing such a large number of cases, which is happening in Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, and in Delhi also. So overall, I will summarize for India that for the health sector, my analysis says that right now, everything in India points to 3 problems. One, still there are low level of testing in certain states, in certain districts. That is a fact. Secondly, there has been implementation failure in containing the spread, especially post lockdown and during the lockdown exit. So lockdown exit planning was not operational very strongly everywhere. People just came on to the street. People were doing their jobs, even including me also. I've started coming to the ministry. I'm sitting right now in the ministry office. I would just be leaving after this presentation. So, I mean, everybody has resumed their jobs and normal everything with limited preventions. But I think all of us need to be doing more, and all of us are responsible, including my own self. And the third gap I would mention about the program in India is that there have been serious impacts on other health services because of coronavirus management. So because like in Bangladesh, we have been directed towards handling COVID-19. So the immunization service have dropped down. The detection rate for the cure, the treatment rates and the detection rate for tuberculosis have come down, which is not a good thing, because ultimately we would be seeing that another epidemic would come up. So it will be a balloon effect. We will try to squeeze one part of the balloon while the other part of the balloon will inflate. I think we need to be looking into holistic picture within the health system and not ignoring the other aspects of the response also, which includes economic aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects, educational aspects, and there are so many things. I think I can continue. So, like in summary, This is how Southeast Asia, all these countries look like. 4 countries are standing out, which includes Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And so far, we have only looked at one aspect, which is the total number of cases. So India having the highest number of cases. If you arrange them in decreasing order, and you would see the highest number of cases being red, which means wrong, which means not good. Then the least number of cases, you can say green. I'm not including DPRK, like I mentioned. So out of these 10 countries, India is definitely coming in red. But this is only one aspect. The other aspect is the moment you click uh, total cases per 1 million population, that's where the situation changes. And I think that's where the Maldives is outlined. And I already discussed the reasons. I think, and following Maldives, I think the India, Bangladesh are again coming in the orange. And then the active number of cases, still India is having the highest number of cases. Then if you look at the tests done per 1 million, which is an important aspect which we need to look into. I know it's not a part of surveillance. The initial phase, initial 2-3 things were part of surveillance. This is where the response starts. This is where the diagnosis starts, which is paramount. And I think I mentioned that one of the gap has been that testing has been an issue. So you see that some other countries, including uh, I would I'm sorry. I would just have to hold for 1 sec, please. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. My apologies. Could you just hold for 1 second? I'm coming.
I think we should go for question answers. Otherwise, people will start leaving.
All right. We can sum up here. So
Dr. Nazneen, please continue.
this is the last slide. I'll just take 1 more minute. So the lesson that I want to share is that imagine there is a bridge which has pillars, and then and there is a scaffolding. There are ropes which are strongly holding this platform. So one of the important pillar is that the community and leader need to be strongly engaged. Second is that there need to be effective communication between the two through clarity, which leads to credibility, and including compassion. I think Dr. Nazneen would be very happy because we had lots of rounds of discussion